Hi, this is Anchal Pathak here, your host for today, presenting to you the third and last episode of Save Karo with Dinero, a unique three-part video series which will spill some of the best kept secrets about investing in the stock markets. In the last video, we understood the concept of the exchange-traded fund or ETF, and in this video, Nikhil joins us. He is the Chief Business Officer of Dinero, and he has some specific advice on how to get started with investing in the ETFs. So, Nikhil, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you doing?
Hi, Anchal. Really glad to be here with you again today. In today's episode, I'll try and break down different metrics that one can use to sort of invest in an ETF. So we've got a lot of things to unpack. So over to you.
All right. So, Nikhil, let's start with my first question. What are some of the metrics of ETFs to follow if one is interested in investing in an ETF?
Sure. So just to remind everybody who's listening to this podcast series, exchange traded funds or ETFs are really the best low cost investment products for new age retail investors. And when one decides to invest in ETFs, there are some important characteristics to note, right? Number one being the asset management company that's offering the ETF. Number two being the assets under management for that particular ETF. Number three being expense ratio, and number four being the tracking error, right? So as you can see, there are quite a few number of metrics one needs to look at when they're interested in investing in an ETF.
Right. So let's start with the expense ratio. Tell us what all of that is about.
Sure. So expense ratio is really defined as the management fees for running or maintaining an ETF, right? Now, we talked about these in our prior videos where we talked about the fees for ETFs actually being 1/10 the cost of regular mutual funds. And in general, the fees for an ETF can range anywhere between 0.05% to about 0.5%, with the average being just about 0.25%. In other words, the average ETF charges you 25 paise for every 100 rupees that you invest in a particular year. So that is really the definition of an expense ratio.
Right. And can you tell us something about tracking error?
Sure. One of the important aspects of investing in an ETF is the tracking error associated with that ETF, right? Now, it's always easier to sort of understand this with an example. Let's take the example of the Nifty index, which is quite popular, and another Nifty 50 ETF that specifically tracks this Nifty index. Now, let's say the Nifty index gained about 20% this year, while the Nifty 50 ETF grew about 19.5% this year. Now, the difference between the returns of the index and the ETF is usually called the tracking error, which is about 0.5% in this case. Now, as a rule of thumb, the lower the tracking error, the more closely an ETF is able to track and replicate the returns of an index. So that's the tracking error for you.
Right. Nikhil, tell us how important is AUM for an ETF? What can you tell us about that?
Sure. So assets under management, or AUM as it's popularly called, is another important metric that investors need to look at while deciding on an ETF to invest in. It really represents the aggregate number of assets that are managed by the ETF. And what that means is the higher the assets under management, the more number of people hold that ETF, which essentially make it easy to buy and sell particular ETFs, right? Now, if you've done all the hard work, if you're not able to sell your ETF, then there's no point investing in that ETF. So usually higher the AUM, the more liquid a particular ETF is. And that's really why it's important for an ETF. Now, taking a step back, I know we've talked about so many different metrics to look at for investors while investing in an ETF. But the easiest way to get started is always look for an ETF with a combination of high assets under management and a low tracking error, and possibly a low expense ratio if you could squeeze that in too. But when you compare two ETFs, always go for the one that has a higher AUM and a lower tracking error. Alternatively, if you still think this is a difficult task, we at Dinero are really curating a platform which will allow retail investors like you and me to take into consideration all these different factors and also invest in ETFs while ensuring that you get rewarded with real digital gold in the form of Dinero gold coins. So sign up for our waitlist at www.dineroai.com and get rewarded with real gold in the form of Dinero gold coins.